The sudden crack of a bullwhip silenced the busy main street of Silverstone, Colorado, as Grace Reynolds stumbled to her knees in the mud, clutching her bruised cheek, while her husband Vernon towered over her, his face contorted with rage. It was 1879, and in this booming silver mining town, folks had learned to mind their business when Vernon Reynolds was in one of his moods. "Thought you could embarrass me in front of the whole mercantile, did you?" Vernon hissed, grabbing her arm roughly and pulling her to her feet. "A wife knows her place." Grace kept her eyes down, her lips pressed firmly together. She hadn't spoken a word in 8 months, not since Vernon had broken her jaw after accusing her of flirting with the bank clerk. The bone had healed poorly under the inexperienced hands of the town doctor, but the deeper wounds remained fresh. At 22, the vibrant girl who had once sung at church socials had disappeared entirely, replaced by a silent shadow. "Get yourself home and prepare my supper," Vernon ordered, shoving her toward their small house at the edge of town. "And don't think about trying to run again. There's nowhere in this territory you can hide from me." Grace nodded once, turning away from the prying eyes of townsfolk who pretended not to notice. Her threadbare dress was spattered with mud, and she could feel a trickle of blood from where her lip had split against her teeth. The humiliation burned worse than the pain. At the edge of her vision, she noticed a stranger leaning against the hitching post outside the saloon, watching the scene unfold with a hard expression. Unlike the other men who quickly averted their gaze, his eyes, a startling blue against his sun-darkened skin, remained fixed on Vernon's retreating back. Then, unexpectedly, they shifted to meet Grace's. She quickly looked away, but not before noticing the quiet intensity in his face. It wasn't pity she saw there, but something far more dangerous: anger. Grace hurried back to the small cabin she shared with Vernon, a ramshackle structure that reflected the deterioration of their 3-year marriage. What had begun as a promising union between the town's most eligible bachelor and the preacher's daughter had quickly soured after the wedding. Vernon's charm had evaporated, revealing a cruel man whose insecurities fueled his rage. As she prepared the stew Vernon expected each evening, Grace heard horses approach outside. Vernon wasn't due back from the saloon for hours, not until he'd drunk away a portion of his mining paycheck and lost another chunk at the card tables. A sharp knock at the door startled her. Visitors were rare. Vernon had successfully isolated her from everyone in town. Wiping her hands on her apron, she cautiously opened the door. Sheriff Daniels stood on her porch, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable. "Mrs. Reynolds, I'm afraid there's been an incident at the saloon. Your husband." Behind him stood the stranger she'd noticed earlier, his expression unreadable. "Vernon drew on the wrong man tonight," the sheriff continued. "This here is Mr. Hayes Lockhart. He's a cattleman passing through from Wyoming territory. Your husband accused him of cheating at cards." The stranger Hayes stepped forward. "Madam, I didn't want this trouble." "Your husband pulled his gun first." Grace's heart stuttered as she understood what they weren't saying. She gestured questioningly, her hand making a small movement toward her throat. "Yes, madam," the sheriff confirmed, misreading her gesture. "Vernon's dead." Mr. Lockhart here was faster on the draw. 3 witnesses confirm it was self-defense. Grace's knees weakened, and she gripped the doorframe to steady herself. Freedom and terror washed over her in equal measure. Without Vernon, she had no protection, no home, no means of support. "Mrs. Reynolds, do you understand what I'm telling you?" Sheriff Daniels asked, concerned by her silence. Grace nodded quickly. "She doesn't speak," Hayes said quietly, studying her face. "Isn't that right, madam?" Surprised, Grace met his gaze and nodded once. "Town council will need to know what you plan to do now," the sheriff said awkwardly. "Vernon's debts are substantial. The cabin and everything in it will likely be seized. Do you have family you can return to?" Grace shook her head. Her father had disowned her when she'd married Vernon against his wishes, and both her parents had died of influenza the previous winter. "I reckon that puts you in a difficult position," the sheriff sighed. "Mrs. Pemberton at the boarding house might take you in if you can work as a laundress, but I killed her husband," Hayes interrupted. "I feel responsible for her situation. Mrs. Reynolds, I own a small ranch north of here. I need a housekeeper, and the position comes with room and board. It would be respectable work until you decide what to do next." The sheriff frowned. "Mr. Lockhart, that hardly seems appropriate. My sister Sarah lives at the ranch, Hayes added. Mrs. Reynolds wouldn't be unchaperoned. Grace studied the tall cowboy, trying to gauge his character. His clothes were worn but clean, his manner direct but not threatening. Most importantly, he had stood up to Vernon when no one else would. Making her decision, Grace nodded and held up one finger, asking for a moment. She disappeared into the cabin, returning with a small cloth bundle containing her few personal possessions, a hairbrush, her mother's Bible, and a faded daguerreotype of her parents. "You'll come now?" Hayes asked, surprised. Grace nodded firmly. There was nothing for her in Silverstone but painful memories. The journey to Hayes Lockhart's ranch took most of the next day. They rode north through mountain passes still dusted with late spring snow. Grace perched uncomfortably on a borrowed mare. Hayes didn't press her to communicate, seemingly content with the silence as they traveled. By late afternoon, they crested a hill overlooking a verdant valley nestled between rocky ridges. A modest ranch house stood near a burbling creek, with several outbuildings, corrals, and a small barn creating a tidy compound. Cattle grazed on the surrounding hillsides, and Grace could make out a vegetable garden beside the house. "It's not much," Hayes said, breaking the day-long silence, "but it's mine. Paid for it with 8 years of driving cattle across 4 territories." Grace offered a small smile, impressed by the peaceful setting. It wasn't large, but the ranch had a tended look that spoke of care and pride. As they approached, a woman emerged from the house, shading her eyes against the setting sun. She was younger than Hayes, perhaps 25, with the same striking blue eyes. "Hayes," she called, hurrying toward them. "You're back early." She stopped short when she spotted Grace. "Who's this?" Hayes dismounted and helped Grace down from her horse. "Sarah, this is Mrs. Grace Reynolds. She'll be staying with us for a while as our housekeeper." Sarah's eyes widened. "The woman from town?" "The one whose husband," she cut herself off, studying Grace's bruised face. Her expression softened. "I see. Well, you're welcome here, Mrs. Reynolds." Grace dipped her head in acknowledgement. "Mrs. Reynolds doesn't speak," Hayes explained, "but she understands everything." Sarah nodded slowly. "I imagine she has her reasons." She stepped forward and gently took Grace's arm. "Come inside. You must be exhausted. I'll show you to your room and find you some clean clothes." The Lockhart home was simple but comfortable, with handmade furniture and colorful quilts that brightened the rough-hewn walls. Grace's room was small but private, with a narrow bed and a window overlooking the creek. After washing away the dust of travel, she changed into a borrowed dress from Sarah and joined the siblings for a simple supper. "I found Mrs. Reynolds in a bad situation in Silverstone," Hayes explained to his sister over beans and cornbread. "Her husband was," he glanced at Grace, "not a good man." "You don't need to explain," Sarah said softly. "The marks on her face tell enough." She turned to Grace. "Whatever brought you here, you're safe now." Grace smiled gratefully, suddenly overwhelmed by the kindness of these strangers. She hadn't felt safe in years. That night, lying in a clean bed with no fear of a drunken husband bursting through the door, Grace wept silently, not from sorrow, but from relief. The following weeks established a new rhythm to Grace's life. She threw herself into her housekeeping duties, grateful to earn her keep. She cooked, cleaned, mended clothes, and helped Sarah with the garden. Though still silent, she found ways to communicate through gestures and expressions. Hayes was often busy with ranch work, but Grace frequently felt his eyes on her. Not in the predatory way Vernon had watched her, but with curiosity and growing concern. He never pressed her to speak, accepting her silence as part of who she was. One evening, after Sarah had retired early with a headache, Hayes found Grace sitting on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. "May I join you?" he asked. Grace nodded, shifting to make room on the bench. Hayes sat beside her, his tall frame dwarfing her slight one. "Sarah tells me you're quite the cook. Says she hasn't eaten this well since our mother was alive." Grace smiled, pleased by the compliment. "I've been meaning to ask, can you write? If you'd like to communicate more easily, I have paper and pencils." Grace hesitated, then shook her head. Her father hadn't believed in educating girls beyond basic household management. "I see," Hayes said thoughtfully. "Would you like to learn?" Surprised, Grace turned to him, a question in her eyes. I taught Sarah to read, and right after our parents died. I could teach you too, if you'd like. The offer touched something deep inside Grace. Vernon had worked hard to keep her ignorant and dependent. The possibility of reading, of having words, even if she couldn't speak them, felt like another kind of freedom. She nodded eagerly. Hayes smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. We'll start tomorrow, then. True to his word, Hayes began teaching Grace her letters the next evening. They sat at the kitchen table after supper, Sarah watching with approval as her brother patiently guided Grace's hand to form each letter. You're a natural, Hayes encouraged as Grace carefully copied the alphabet. Your hand is steady. The lessons continued each evening, becoming a cherished routine. Grace made rapid progress, soon graduating from letters to simple words. Hayes brought her a journal, encouraging her to practice forming sentences. Now you can tell us what you're thinking, he said as he presented her with the bound book. Your voice doesn't need sound to be heard. Grace wrote her first complete sentence that night. Thank you for your kindness. As spring blossomed into summer, Grace found herself healing in ways she hadn't thought possible. The bruises faded from her skin, and though she remained silent, her expressions became more animated, her gestures more confident. She began to notice things about Hayes: the gentleness with which he treated the animals, how he always ensured Sarah had the best portions at dinner, the way he hummed old trail songs when he thought no one was listening. Unlike Vernon, whose charm had been a thin veneer over cruelty, Hayes's gruff exterior concealed a fundamentally decent man. On a warm July evening, Grace was hanging laundry when she noticed a group of riders approaching from the south. She counted 5 men, all armed, their horses kicking up dust as they cantered toward the ranch house. Grace hurried inside to find Hayes cleaning his rifle at the table. I see them, he said, noting her alarm. Those are Blackwell's men, neighboring rancher who's been trying to push me off this land for years. Sarah appeared from her room. What do they want now? Same as always. To intimidate us. Hayes stood, checking his pistol before tucking it into his holster. Sarah, take Grace to the back room and stay there. Grace shook her head firmly, pointing to herself and then outside. You want to stand with me? Hayes asked, surprised. She nodded, her eyes determined. It could be dangerous. Grace pointed to the rifle, then mimicked shooting. Vernon had forced her to learn to hunt when money was tight. A slow smile spread across Hayes's face. You're full of surprises, Mrs. Reynolds. He handed her the rifle. Stay on the porch, behind the post. Only if things go bad. Grace took up her position as Hayes walked out to meet the approaching riders. From her vantage point, she could see the tension in his shoulders, though his voice remained steady. Blackwell, he greeted the lead rider, a corpulent man with a florid face. You're a long way from your own property. Just making rounds, Lockhart, Blackwell replied, his tone falsely jovial. Checking on my neighbors. 5 armed men seems excessive for a social call. Blackwell's smile tightened. I heard you brought back a woman from Silverstone. The wife of that fellow you shot. Hayes stiffened. Mrs. Reynolds is my housekeeper. Her situation is none of your concern. Town's talking. Says she's damaged goods. Mute as a post, and living unchaperoned with a bachelor. My sister lives here, Hayes replied evenly. And I'd advise you to watch your tongue when speaking about Mrs. Reynolds. One of Blackwell's men snickered. Sounds like you've got a soft spot for the widow, Lockhart. I respect Mrs. Reynolds, Hayes said firmly. Something you boys clearly know nothing about. Blackwell leaned forward in his saddle. Listen here, Lockhart. I've been patient. I've made you fair offers for this land. My patience is running thin. This land isn't for sale. Not to you. Not to anyone. Everything has a price, Blackwell growled. One way or another, I'll have this valley by winter. Is that a threat? Take it however you want. Blackwell's eyes shifted to the porch, narrowing when he spotted Grace with the rifle. Seems your housekeeper has some spirit after all. Hayes stepped deliberately into his line of sight. You've said your piece. Now get off my land. For a tense moment, Grace thought violence would erupt. Then Blackwell laughed harshly. We'll go? For now. Think about my offer, Lockhart. Next time it won't be so generous. The riders wheeled their horses around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. Hayes watched until they disappeared over the ridge, then turned back to the house. His eyes met Grace's, a silent exchange of relief passing between them. Blackwell's been trying to buy us out for 3 years, he explained that evening as they sat on the porch. He wants to dam the creek to water his own grazing land. Would dry out half our pasture. Grace wrote in her journal. Why does he want your land so badly? Water rights, Hayes sighed. It's always about water in these parts. My father was smart enough to claim land with a year-round creek. Blackwell's cattle are suffering in this drought. Will he come back? Eventually. He's used to getting his way. Are you afraid? Hayes considered the question. Not for myself, but I worry about Sarah. And now you. Grace touched his arm lightly, drawing his attention. I'm not afraid when I'm with you, she wrote. Something flickered in Hayes's eyes, surprise, followed by a warmth that made Grace's heart beat faster. Without thinking, she reached up and touched his cheek, feeling the rough stubble beneath her fingertips. Hayes caught her hand gently. Grace, he said softly, the first time he'd used her given name. You've been through a terrible ordeal. I would never want you to feel obligated or pressured because I offered you shelter. Grace shook her head emphatically and wrote, You are nothing like him. Never like him. Even so, you deserve time to heal, to find your own way. I'm finding it, she wrote. Here, with you. Hayes looked at her for a long moment. Then slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to her forehead. When you're ready, truly ready, I'll be here. The gesture, so gentle and respectful, brought tears to Grace's eyes. She nodded, grateful for his understanding. As summer faded into autumn, Grace's confidence grew. Her writing improved rapidly, and she began helping Sarah with the ranch accounts. Hayes took her riding across the property, showing her the boundaries of his land and teaching her about cattle ranching. In the evenings, they sat together on the porch, sometimes in comfortable silence, sometimes with Grace writing long passages in her journal for Hayes to read. She learned that Hayes had fought briefly in the war before heading west at 18, that he'd worked as a cowhand on a dozen different ranches before saving enough to buy this land, that he'd raised Sarah since she was 12 after their parents died of typhoid. In turn, she shared snippets of her own past, her childhood as a preacher's daughter, her naive dreams of marriage, the slow horror of realizing the true nature of the man she'd wed. What she didn't write about was her growing feelings for Hayes, how her heart quickened when he entered a room, how she found herself watching the strong lines of his back as he worked, how she treasured each small touch or gentle word. She sensed he felt the same, but true to his word, he never pressed for more than she offered. The first frost had just touched the valley when trouble returned. Grace was picking the last of the garden vegetables when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Looking up, she saw not Blackwell and his men, but a lone rider she didn't recognize. Hayes emerged from the barn, hand resting on his pistol as the stranger approached. You Lockhart, the man called. I am. State your business. Name's Fowler. I work for Judge Harmon over in Silverstone. The man dismounted, producing an official-looking document. Got papers here regarding Mrs. Vernon Reynolds. Grace froze, vegetables clutched in her apron. Hayes took the document, scanning it with a deepening frown. What's this about? Judge is reviewing the Reynolds estate. Turns out the deceased had outstanding debts with several businesses in town. Since Mrs. Reynolds disappeared before formal proceedings, the judge wants her back in Silverstone to settle matters. She's not hiding, Hayes said firmly. She's employed here as my housekeeper. Be that as it may, she's required to appear before the judge next Tuesday. If she doesn't show, she'll be charged with abandoning her lawful debts. Grace approached slowly, setting down her basket and standing beside Hayes. Mrs. Reynolds, Fowler acknowledged with a nod. Sorry about the trouble, madam, but it's a legal matter now. Hayes handed Grace the document. We'll be there, he said to Fowler. Both of us. After the messenger departed, Hayes turned to Grace. I won't let them harass you. Whatever debts Vernon left, we'll figure it out. Grace wrote quickly. I have no money to pay his debts. You don't need to worry about that. I'll handle it. No, she wrote firmly. Not your responsibility. Grace, Hayes said gently. I care about what happens to you. More than I probably should, given the circumstances. But even if I didn't, I wouldn't let anyone be forced to pay for that man's misdeeds. Their journey back to Silverstone was somber. Grace found herself growing more tense as they approached the town where she'd suffered so much. Hayes noticed her discomfort and reached across to touch her hand reassuringly. You're not alone this time, he reminded her. I won't leave your side. The town looked smaller than Grace remembered, the streets narrower, the buildings less imposing. They stopped first at the sheriff's office to announce their arrival. Sheriff Daniels seemed surprised to see them. Mrs. Reynolds, you're looking well. Didn't expect to see you back in these parts. Hayes explained about the summons, and the sheriff frowned. That's peculiar. Vernon's debts weren't substantial enough to warrant legal proceedings. Mostly just tabs at the saloon and mercantile. Then why would the judge summon her back? Hayes asked. The sheriff looked uncomfortable. Judge Harmon is Blackwell's brother-in-law. If Blackwell's taken an interest in your affairs. Hayes's expression darkened. I see. So this is about pressuring me, not about legitimate debts. I can't say for certain, the sheriff hedged, but I'd be careful. Blackwell has influence in this town. The meeting with Judge Harmon confirmed their suspicions. The white-haired magistrate barely glanced at Grace, directing all his comments to Hayes. Mrs. Reynolds abandoned her legal residence without proper notification, the judge stated. There are outstanding debts totaling $87, which we're prepared to pay, Hayes countered, though I find it unusual that collection requires a formal hearing. The judge's lips thinned. There's also the matter of the cabin and property. As Mrs. Reynolds fled town before probate was completed, she didn't flee. Hayes interrupted. She accepted lawful employment. Nevertheless, her abandonment of the property complicates matters. The simplest resolution would be for Mrs. Reynolds to formally relinquish any claim to the Reynolds property. Grace glanced at Hayes questioningly. The cabin sits on land adjacent to Blackwell's mining interests, Hayes explained quietly. I'd wager that's what this is really about. Grace nodded in understanding and reached for her journal. She wrote quickly and showed the page to the judge. I make no claim to Vernon Reynolds' property or possessions. I will pay his legitimate debts. The judge frowned at her written communication, but nodded. Very well. Sign this waiver. Pay the clerk the outstanding amount, and you're free to go. After completing the transaction, Hayes and Grace left the courthouse. That was too easy, Hayes muttered. Blackwell's up to something. They were crossing the street toward the livery when a familiar voice called out. Well, if it isn't the gunslinger and his mute woman. Blackwell stood on the boardwalk outside the saloon, flanked by two of his men. His face was flushed with alcohol, his voice carrying down the street. Hayes tensed but kept walking, guiding Grace with a gentle hand at her elbow. Don't ignore me, Lockhart, Blackwell shouted, stepping into their path. I'm talking to you. We have no business with you, Blackwell, Hayes said evenly. Step aside. Oh, but we do have business, Blackwell sneered. You've been stubborn about selling that land. Maybe your woman can convince you to be reasonable. Mrs. Reynolds has no part in this. Now move. Blackwell's eyes narrowed. She must be something special and private to have you so protective. Does she make noise then, at least? Hayes's hand dropped to his pistol. That's enough. Or maybe she just nods and smiles while you do whatever you want. Convenient arrangement. Before Hayes could respond, Grace stepped forward, her eyes blazing with fury. For the first time in nearly a year, she opened her mouth deliberately. Go to hell. Her voice was raspy from disuse, barely above a whisper, but in the suddenly silent street, everyone heard it clearly. Blackwell's jaw dropped. Hayes stared at her in shock. Grace turned to Hayes, her voice still rough, but gaining strength. Take me home, please. Without another word, Hayes guided her past the stunned Blackwell and toward the livery. Only when they were out of earshot did he speak. Grace, not here, she whispered. At home. They rode hard that afternoon, pushing to reach the ranch before nightfall. Sarah's surprise at their early return turned to astonishment when Grace greeted her with a hoarse hello. After Sarah had gone to bed, Hayes and Grace sat before the fire, the autumn night bringing a chill to the air. Why now? Hayes asked gently. After all this time? Grace's voice was still raspy, each word carefully formed. Vernon broke more than my jaw. He broke my spirit. Made me believe my words had no value. After a while, silence became armor. What changed? You did. She looked up at him, eyes shining in the firelight. You never demanded I speak, yet you always listened. You gave me back my voice by respecting my silence. Hayes reached for her hand. When you spoke today, I couldn't let him dishonor what we have, she said simply. And I realized something important. Vernon silenced me through fear. But with you, I'm not afraid anymore. Grace, Hayes said softly, what exactly do we have? She smiled, the full, radiant smile she'd kept hidden for so long. I was hoping you might tell me. I'm still learning to speak my mind. Hayes moved from his chair to kneel before her. I think we have a beginning. If you want it. I do, she whispered. I have for some time. Hayes reached up to touch her cheek, his calloused fingers infinitely gentle. I fell in love with you without ever hearing your voice. Now that I have, I only love you more. Say it again, Grace urged softly. I love you. No one has ever said that to me and meant it. I mean it with everything I am, Hayes assured her. I'll spend a lifetime proving it, if you'll let me. Grace leaned forward, closing the distance between them. I love you too, she whispered against his lips before kissing him softly. When they parted, Hayes pressed his forehead to hers. Will you marry me, Grace? Not because you need protection or shelter, but because we choose each other. Yes, she answered, her voice growing stronger with each word. I choose you. I choose us. 2 months later, as winter snow blanketed the valley, Grace and Hayes were married in a small ceremony at the ranch, with Sarah and a few neighboring ranchers as witnesses. Blackwell had made no further trouble, apparently deterred by the sheriff's warning that harassing the Lockharts would bring unwanted attention to his business dealings. On their wedding night, as they lay tangled together in the quiet darkness, Grace traced the line of Hayes's jaw with her fingertips. I never thought I'd find joy again, she confessed. When you found me, I was empty inside. Hayes caught her hand and kissed her palm. You were never empty, Grace. You were waiting, finding your strength. I found it because of you. No, he corrected gently. You found it because it was always there. I just gave you the space to remember. Grace smiled, nestling closer to her husband. Do you know what I like best about talking again? What's that? Being able to tell you I love you. Being able to say your name. Hayes pulled her closer. I like hearing both of those things very much. Hayes, she whispered, testing the sound of his name on her lips. My Hayes. Always, he promised, sealing the vow with a kiss. As spring returned to the valley, bringing new calves and fresh green grass, Grace stood on the porch of the ranch house, watching Hayes mend a fence in the distance. Her hand rested lightly on her abdomen, where the first signs of new life were beginning to show. Soon, she would tell him about the child growing within her. Soon, their voices would be joined by another. But for now, she savored the simple joy of standing in the sunshine, free to speak or to be silent as she chose, loving and beloved in return. The woman who had once been silenced by cruelty now filled her days with words of love, laughter, and hope. And in the moments when words failed, Hayes understood her silence to the peaceful quiet of a heart finally, truly at home.